Well, hey everybody, this is Dr. Austin Perlmutter. In this video, I want to follow up on a post I did last week about mental health and how we really need to look at it in a different way, and how it's key that we take into account the role of the gut, the role of the immune system, and the role of the endocrine system in reshaping our, I guess, even perception of the world, but certainly our conception of mental health and how these conditions develop, as well as treatment modalities for these things. So, as I mentioned in the post, my training in internal medicine kind of led me to think about mental health conditions as another one of the problems on the list. And so, just like chronic diseases like heart disease or diabetes, mental health, like issues like a depression or an anxiety or a PTSD, became a item on the problem list. And for the most part, the treatment modalities were two things. It was either prescribing antidepressant, anti-anxiolytics, or it would be sending people to psychotherapy or some combination of the two. And I don't want to take anything away from this. I think these are really important modalities to use for people who are experiencing these conditions. But what I really think we're missing here is the conversation about what's going on in the body, what's going on in the brain, and how there may be alterations in these systems that I mentioned that are both contributing to and maybe areas of intervention that we can be thinking about as far as how we can better conceptualize the pathophysiology as well as the treatment options. So I want to get into for a moment kind of these three different systems that I believe are key to these conditions, and then talk a little bit about what maybe we could be doing differently in using that information in our approach towards managing these conditions. So first of all, let's talk about the stress axis. And I think as it relates to the endocrine system, there are a lot of different hormonal pathways that are involved, but probably the HPA axis, as you probably know, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, basically the stress pathway, is one of the keys. This is especially the case as it relates to anxiety conditions. It's also been significantly implicated in depression, but really thinking about how the stress system is overactivated and pathologically activated in the case of something like a PTSD or another anxiety disorder. And understanding that this stress axis, this HPA axis, is kind of one of the most responsive elements that we have in our body to whatever is going on around us, that it is enabling us to, in the short term, react to potential threats, dangers, signals, but in the long term, when it's chronically overactivated, that may be a principal contributor to these anxiety type conditions. So what I think is important here is not just understanding that we need to be taking the stress axis into account, but asking, how is this programmed? And so one of the things that I'm investigating right now is how early life influences are programming the stress axis. So how early life exposures, even prenatal exposures, are influencing this HPA axis, and then what we can do to maybe provide advice to people who are mothers or parents who are trying to do the best for raising kids with a stable HPA axis. That kind of led me into looking into the role of the microbiome and how this relates to the HPA axis. So the microbiome, the gut, is definitely another major factor in these mental health conditions, and we're increasingly learning through the study of psychobiotics, for example, that you can modulate your microbiome, your gut health, in order to change outcomes for mental health conditions. We also know that there is dysbiosis in a lot of mental health conditions. So when you look at depressed people, they tend to have different ratios of the primary phyla of their gut microbiome. So how does then that relate back to this HPA axis? Well, what we know is that the HPA axis and the microbiome have this bidirectional relationship where you really need a healthy microbiome in order to program in a healthy HPA axis. And this has been primarily studied in early life and specifically in germ-free mice. But what we know is that these are the types of things we need to be thinking about for even adults, and that is, if you want to stabilize your HPA axis, you really need to think about your microbiome, and vice versa. So we know that, for example, when you have high levels of cortisol, that's the kind of thing that may lead to increased intestinal permeability, and that increased intestinal permeability can actually lead to dysbiosis. It can also lead to inflammation and other things that are associated with worse mental health. We also know that the gut itself seems to regulate, in some ways, our stress axis, and so the pathways there are still being elucidated, but it is certainly interesting to note that our gut bacteria are sending signals to our brain, and that is perhaps by way of the vagus nerve, but also by way of peripheral signals that reach the brain through the blood-brain barrier, modifying our stress response. And so the last thing to mention here, as I said in the post, is the immune system. I would say, of anything, this is the thing that I'm most interested in right now, because the immune system, I think, has been for a long time undervalued as a primary mechanism of modulating health. We're learning that immunity is involved with metabolic health, it's involved with mental health, it's involved with basically every aspect of what we define as chronic health conditions. So why does that matter for mental health? Well, as I've said many times, and as I'm sure you're probably aware by now, chronic inflammation is strongly associated with the development of depression. It seems that the activation of certain cytokines, things like IL-6, things like tumor necrosis factor alpha, like interleukin-1 beta, that these are things, when peripherally elevated, in addition to some of the more basic inflammatory markers like CRP, that actually predict higher levels of depression. And why that is so interesting to me is that inflammation is a form of pathological immune activation when it's chronic, is something that we can change through our diet, through helping our gut health, through working on our stress axis, our HPA axis. So you can see all of these things are really quite intertwined. But again, as it relates to this immunity mental health overlap, I think it's important to note that it's not all depression that is thought to be a cause or caused by immune dysregulation or elevated inflammation. And Dr. Charles Razon has actually shown this with one of his trials, where he showed that only a certain subset of people with depression with elevated inflammatory markers were really responsive to anti-inflammatory interventions, in this case a drug that specifically blocked a step of the inflammation pathway. So to tie all this together, what is the take-home message, and what does this mean as far as the next steps in understanding this and then translating that into patient care? I am of the mind that we do a very poor job of just acknowledging the mental health issues in the United States, and then of having an integrated kind of pathway, an integrated plan that incorporates things like dietary modification, incorporates things like stress axis modulation, incorporates things like gut health, in helping people to both understand the causes of their depression and anxiety, but also to overcome it. And so I think that the more things that we're able to link to these conditions, the better it is for us, because it gives us the more entry points into creating kind of pathways to, or protocols around, helping people to improve these conditions. I think that, the first step is to destigmatize these conditions and to say, just like things like heart disease and diabetes, that mental health conditions are strongly linked to visible changes in our body on a molecular level, changes in our stress hormones, changes in our gut health, changes in our inflammatory markers. So this isn't just something where you blame somebody for having poor mental health. You can say, no, there are real changes in your body that we can look at and that we can measure and that we can potentially change through things like dietary and exercise lifestyle modification, which is really important, because then it isn't some sort of disease of the mind that there's nothing you can do about, that it's basically you develop this condition and we don't really know how it's happening. It becomes something that you can actually target. And so there's a lot of nutritional psychology and psychiatry that's going on that's really excellent as far as taking this the next step forward. There's a doctor named Drew Ramsey who's actually written a book, or is writing a book on this subject right now. And there are actually a couple other books that have come out on this as well. So I can make those recommendations if you guys are interested in learning more there. But the take-home message I'd love for you guys to have after watching this video is that our mental health conditions are a lot more nuanced than we might give them credit for being. That it's not just about, in my case, the SIGI CAPS diagnostic criteria that I learned when I was in training, where it's you either have depression or you don't, and if you do, then the next step is to prescribe an antidepressant or psychotherapy or both. It's to say, that these are nuanced conditions that are a reflection of our physiology, our metabolism, our endocrine system, our immune function, our gut health. And when we put all of this together, we can reconceptualize these mental health conditions as, again, a manifestation of the same types of things that contribute to other chronic medical conditions, destigmatize them, and provide people with next steps to help to manage these problems. All right, so that's my video. I hope it was interesting to you. If you're interested in learning more about anything I mentioned, just leave a comment and I'll be sure to get back to you. Thanks.